I have the we have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Sylvan Baker today. Sylvan is a lecturer in community performance and probably one of the world's greatest minds around applied theater, in my mind. I got to know Sylvan because I was a student at the Royal Central School. I still am a student at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. I'm getting my MFA in actor training and coaching, but I made Sylvan's acquaintance while I was over there and knew that he was someone that our network would benefit from greatly, especially just in terms of our approach to incarcerated settings. So we're so thankful to have you here today, Sylvan. And I guess, my how I'd like to start this conversation is if you would just give us a little overview of the applied theater program there at Central, your role in it, where it's been, where it's at right now, and where you're trying to push it to.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Scott. And can I just say at the outset, thank you very much to the Shakespeare in Prisons Conference for giving me the opportunity to have these conversations with you. It's a thing. It's an interesting thing that when I last came to the US, or actually that's a lie. When I first came to the US on a conference about 3 or 4 years ago for the ATHA conference, I was quite taken aback by the fact that applied theatre, as I understand it, doesn't or didn't seem to be a thing in the US. And frankly, I was shocked. What we talk about at the Central School of Speech and Drama is really running a program that allows younger or emerging scholars and practitioners and artists to help decide where and how they want to practice. So at the core of the program really is this idea that with the prevailing wind, we are helping to nurture the practitioners, artists, and researchers who will enter the field. So what that means is that the alignment of the program is about the aesthetics that are underpinning the theoretical positions that we share. Applied theatre, in its sort of shortest definition, would be the application of theatre and performative practices in environments that are not considered a theatre. So the majority of my work in the past and to date may not even entail a full performance. And if it does entail a performance, it will only take place as part of a wider process. We are consciously, as applied theatre makers, instrumentally using some of these practices. And I know that for some practitioners and scholars, the idea of instrumentalizing the arts can send chills down their spines and trigger an existential dread. And I would invite you, if you have an interest in working in the areas of social justice that you clearly do by being part of this wonderful event, to muse on the fact that probably in your practice, you are already consciously and unconsciously instrumentalizing parts of the arts. And actually, that's not a problem. We're fine with that. I don't know whether we should get bogged down with the idea that there has to be a sake for the arts. There is a discourse in the UK about arts for art's sake. Quite frankly, it's not an interesting debate, so we're not going to go there. But if you're an undergraduate student or a postgraduate student and you want to develop a praxis, and the important thing about that praxis is that it's practice, theory, in a virtuous circle. The practice increases the theory. The theory allows you a different perspective on your practice, and so on and so on. So I came to the academy primarily as a practitioner, and I'm now sort of in that interstitial state of being a practitioner researcher who is now a fraud in either camp. So don't know where I find myself. But working from the margins has never particularly been a problem for me. So I'm kind of happy and comfortable in that state. So when there is not a global pandemic in action, the course allows you at the undergraduate level to discover as many areas and contexts that would be impacted by an applied practice, and then decide where you would like to specialize and how you would like to specialize and how you would like to contribute to the existing so-called pool of knowledge that sits in the discourse. I suppose probably central to the idea, the pedagogy that sits behind it, is that it is a critical and reflective pedagogy. So productively, we are spending a lot of time saying, what just happened? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I going to do now? Which is potentially a different approach to some of the maybe craft-based approaches that sit behind a more actorly training paradigm. I can't say too much about that because I don't know very much about actor training. So I'm not going to pass comment or denigrate or come up with some fulsome theory about it. But what I do know about applied theatre is it's been on a journey over the past 25 years. And I'm kind of pleased that it has, because it's moved on from its kind of Victorian, in we come, virtue signaling, we're here to help paradigm, into a much more respectful, working alongside, co-collaborative, co-experiential journey. One of the things which is central to my practice is that the people whom are participants in my work are not the subject of the research. They are co-researchers alongside. And it may be that we will garner different things out of working together, but ethically, it's fundamental that they get something. I don't want to go and work in a community and come away with an MFA or a PhD, and they come away with nothing. They come away not changed. That, for me, is one of the biggest dangers and threats of the field. I jokingly, and I think I've said this to Scott, I call it the cake paradigm or the candy paradigm. It's like you go to a community and you make them very consciously aware that they don't have candy, and then you leave. And so what you now know, and what they now know, is they know what candy tastes like, and they also know that they don't have it. And that strikes me as being a deeply problematic state of affairs. So incumbent in the beginning of my practice is its ending, so that it is a handing on rather than an endowing of wisdom. I am by no means a guru. What I talk about is not fact. It is based in three odd decades of field work and practice and some engagement with theory. But even tonight, in a wonderful environment like this, in our respective spaces, I would relish the opportunity to discover new things and to be invited to think differently about what I thought I knew. And I think those ideas are at the center of the undergraduate course, which is Contemporary Performance Practices at Central now, and in the MA Applied Theatre. That's probably the longest answer stroke advert that you've had for a while, Scott. So I'll stop there.
That was fantastic, actually. I love it. So yeah, it's a beautiful program, and we got a couple former students actually here with us today too. So first up, what I'd like to remind everyone is this is an informal Q&A chat. What we ask is that you put a question in the chat box, and as the conversation ebbs and flows, we may call you into this space to ask your question directly to Sylvan, or you can just defer and say, no, just read it out of the box or whatever. But we welcome those questions at any time. The big question I ask now, this is going back to the pre-record that we did a month and a half ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's Blur's Day every day. So one of the things that really stuck out to me was the use of the word to decolonize. And it's something that I am totally guilty of because I'm interrogating my pedagogical approaches all over, let alone just in incarcerated spaces. But this idea of decolonize, 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 and I understand how the usage of that word has become watered down, and as you rightly say, almost pejorative. And I'm wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit for us to just understand, like, are we looking through the wrong lens? Are we looking in the wrong direction altogether? How can we write our course?
I think answering that question starts to reveal the nuances and complexities of what we want to talk about, because a lot of the technologies that perpetuate the oppressions that we're wanting to combat have found a way to inveigle themselves into systems and into institutions. So as soon as you start to think about a challenge, a resistance, a dissent, I think it's worth considering alongside that how those structures will react, how power in its, if I was being at my most sort of blithe about this, how power responds. And it's interesting because we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic. And maybe one way to conceive of that is to conceive of power as an antigen, because it will respond to whatever situations are putting it at threat. Over here in the UK at the moment, we have a new strain, a new variant of the COVID-19 virus. And ostensibly, what's behind that mutation, knowing that the virus is mutating in terms of biology daily. But this new variant has gained traction because it has traits that allow it to continue to be infectious, when the previous iteration of the virus was starting to lose its contact because of social distancing, vaccination, PPE, mask wearing, and hopefully some sensible behavior. Suddenly we have and this is the last time I'm going to speak about biology today, really. Suddenly we have a virus which is more infectious to younger people and therefore is finding a way to spread itself, to perpetuate itself. And I think, not in a conspiracy theory way, I think it's useful to think about how oppressive structures are able to do that. I quote Dr. Gavin Grindon often and say that you should never underestimate the recuperative power of power. It will respond to whatever assaults there are on it. And again, that's what sounds slightly paranoid. But if you take the long view and step back and think about your practices, then think about what has been achieved, what gains there have been in terms of social justice, but also think about how often and to what extent the status quo is still the status quo. The people who are in charge are still in charge. Okay, there was an inauguration, so not all of them, but in the main, the people who are in charge are still in charge. So at some point, scholars and activists began talking about the idea of decolonization as a way to draw into focus the fact that 93% of the globe had been conquered or invaded at some point in history. And so the one idea of decolonization was that how could we conceive of how, as a power that had been conquered by another, that we could extricate ourselves from that influence? Fine. So suddenly we have this idea which has a focus and an alignment that talks about an awareness of where the challenge is and starts to marshal forces to challenge that problem, that structure. But then the institutions kick in again, and what starts to happen is the transactions that were opening and considered useful in terms of an awareness, making an aspiration to being something that would count as being decolonized, start to become denuded. Sarah Ahmed often talks about how institutional diversity is operationally defanged, it's powerless. And you see it manifested, particularly in places like the academy, in roles like diversity champion, equalities lead. And once a new thinking is integrated into the structure, it's no longer integrated, it's assimilated. So in the UK, the discourse around this area has turned its back on the notion of diversity, because what happens is people start to say, oh yeah, we're doing diversity, instead of actually saying what they are doing. Yeah, we've got a really diverse campus. This is a really diverse course. This is a really diverse program. We hire in a really diverse way. What does that mean? And in just saying the blanket terms, is there a risk that you are no longer focusing on with robustness on what may continue to need to change? And so this idea that we've got to decolonize is potentially slipping into that area, because most of the places we've been talking about in reality have already been decolonized. Yet the residue, the implication, the impact of the fact that those systems were predicated by a conquering power have not exited the scene. So the idea that the authority, the grouping that were the conquerors have left is kind of disingenuous if the idea that the structures that they set up are now so normalized, are now so ever present as to become virtually imperceptible, invisible. The biggest trick that colonization did was almost make itself like it didn't exist. So we're looking through a set of lenses that have been cut and refracted by others. And until we are not just questioning of how they make us see, but also questioning of those very lenses themselves, we can be hostages to fortune about this. We have a decolonized, we have an equalities officer, there's an equalities plan, we're covered. We've done diversity, we've done decolonial work. When in reality, that plan is not a living plan. It's been a boring day for members of faculty to go through training. And those whose privilege means that they don't have to engage with this on a regular basis can go back to more habitual functioning. So that's what I mean about the pejorative danger of terminology. To be quite honest with you, we could call it apple pie. I don't mind what we call it, as long as we are doing something about it and not hiding behind the nomenclature. Doing diversity is different from being inclusive. And I want us to go to being inclusive. I want us to talk about anti-racism, homophobia, sexism, classism, fat shaming, rather than inclusivity and diversity. Because in the euphemism, we lose power.
So this is why he's here today, everyone.
that got radical quickly. Radical quickly.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So I know as a white cishet, male, that my pursuit of anti-racism is a daily practice, that I'm committing to learning and exposing those supremacist privileges that exist within our culture, and that does take work, because what you just said was brilliant about the real success of supremacism being that it made itself almost imperceptible. And I feel that, the murders that just, rocked the nation this last summer, first off, a couple centuries late. Secondly, the after effect of that being, okay, I did the anti-racism. I did the diversity for, 4 weeks. I did like 3 workshops in 4 weeks. we're sorted.
Done.
Yeah, anti-racism achieved. So for me personally, I have adopted the mantra of harm reduction. I know that beyond racism, homophobia, et cetera, there is a certain othering of either a group or an individual that contributes to a societal acceptance of this harm that's being perpetrated on this group or individual. And that's where I can be right now, but I'm still journeying toward true anti-racism, right? So for those that are here with us today, can you maybe give us some resources, some places to start in terms of looking inward? Because this is a really important part of the conference for us. The activism, as it were, for the conference this year is looking inward. So as opposed to us looking at it as a group at a certain issue, we're trying to call back into ourselves. Can we look at a cellular level where these types of privileges and prejudices exist? So I guess I'm just asking for some baby steps of where folks can get started if they haven't engaged in this work.
I think it's a brilliant question. I think on one level, if as practitioners, people are looking in this direction, one of the things that they may want to bear in mind for themselves is a certain amount of forgiveness. Because if you are totally committed to wanting to re-engineer your practice, I love the term, Scott, at a cellular level. If you want to break it down to that degree, there is the potential for pain. There is the potential for you to realize that very strongly held beliefs or very ingrained habitual practices have been and are exclusive. There is the potential that you, one, may have been working and operating under certain percepts that are just plain wrong. And sometimes being brought into convocation with those elements of information is painful. I did not mean, so like you park intention. Generally, people working in this area, in this discipline, we know what their alignment is. We know what their intentionality is. But it's worth, I guess, thinking about the injury and those that are encountering the injury and don't have the luxury of not engaging with this on a daily basis, 24/7, 365. And that's where it gets really challenging. I'm just going to mute my video for a second just to show you a statement which is bouncing around our campus at the moment. And the point is really quite a sharp one. Suddenly, if you've been in a position of comfort and privilege, a challenge to that privilege is painful, destabilizing, discomforting. So there's almost a parallel to the recovery model, in as much as it's difficult to make profound changes until you bottom out, until you can say, there is most definitely a problem. And not only is there most definitely a problem, it's not over there, it's here. And once you can get to that space, and that's no easy task in itself, it's then a case of taking nothing for granted, absolutely nothing. At Central at the moment, as part of this process, and those of you who may have been following the press will know that the journey that Central has been on over the last 2 or 3 years has been precipitously bad in terms of how they've engaged with the residues of racism and colony that are present in their school. because they are endemic in the structure. The school is a conservatoire. Conservatoires come into being to conserve. They are conservative by definition. Then when you bring into play institutionality, well, we're going to get a team together and the team will have a task, a complete and finished group. Already, you're starting to lose momentum. Already, you're starting to depersonalize the challenge. So in the UK, studying what happened after the uprising in the US, after the murders of George Floyd and Breanna Taylor and others, one of the first things I noted was how the language was used to articulate what happened. Often in the mainstream media, it was the killings of these unfortunate African Americans. Now, this was murder, and we know it was murder. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is how quickly the discourse moved from individuals talking about my life is at risk into other factors, into reparation, into statues, into the canon, into the curriculum. And for me, that was a prime example of power adapting to the threat. So the discourse in the UK moved to the protection and the damage of statues and their removal and the deflection of roads must fall. Not that these are not valid campaigns, but the beginning of the re-emergence of this discourse was completely centered around lives and the risk to them, and not bronze. But by shifting the dialogue from lives, I do not feel safe in my community, and I can be shot at when I'm unarmed and running away, or restrained for an additional number of minutes when I am already unconscious, moved to, well, the people who have been immortalized in monuments did some good things and some bad things. There are good people in both sides. No, that's not the point. So take nothing for granted if you are looking at wanting to make your practice inclusive. And I don't want to say inclusive too often because I don't want it to become a pejorative word. What are the barriers? What are the assumptions that you are basing your practice on? And how can you get feedback on them? Because I like to credit your former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, for bringing to my attention that you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. And that's the Johari's window. I know what I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I know that others can see things about me and my practice that I can't see. And then the last quadrant is stuff that is unknown, that none of us know. So personal reflection, really important. Honesty, openness, and humility that there's a very strong probability that you will get stuff wrong and are still getting stuff wrong. Peer interaction. Critical friendship is essential at this point. And the alignment of that critical friendship can get crunchy. In my thinking at the moment, I am beyond allyship. I'm looking for accomplices, if only I could say it. I need people who've got skin in the game, because then I know that the risks for them are potentially as great as they are for me. And I've seen a lot of that globally in the uprising. Sometimes that step can be destabilized because of a liberal fragility around, oh gosh, I'm going to be speaking for people I don't want to. Okay. The thing is, if we're going to actually make incursions into these oppressive structures, it cannot just be those who are oppressed who are doing it. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be at the forefront. That doesn't mean that people who actually get benefit from the system as it stands shouldn't stand alongside them. But what we need to be careful of now is that we are potentially diverting too much energy to worrying about that and not fixing the problem. It's interesting that students I spoke to, our term semester has just begun at Central again, remotely, but it's just begun. And some students, some white students said, yeah, but Black Lives Matter is not a thing anymore because it's not in the news. And that, you know, it's I see shock on some people's faces, but I can understand that it's a valid thought to them, because from their position, they may or may not be fully aware of the privilege that they hold, and they are therefore not being compelled to engage with this on a daily basis. Before all of the travel bans, I thought seriously about coming back to the US while this is as charged as it is. Because if I'm being shot at, they won't know that I'm an English scholar. They will see a black man. They won't see an academic. They will see a black man. And so I genuinely had to consider the risk assessment of this. It is not safe. And that's what's at stake. So for those not, and that's not a badge of office or heroism, it's probably a labor and a burden in reality. For those not in that position, who are increasingly becoming aware of the frames of privilege, and I don't say that with blame, because that's the problem. When we start to talk about this, an emotional charge becomes attached to it, because this is about life and death and emotionality. So if I start talking about mortality rates of black people to white people, it's uncomfortable for me. It's uncomfortable for them. So we have to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, because it's a given, it's a fact. If you want to be active in this area, you don't have to justify your activity. You know, I would say that in that respect, I would say I don't know what I would define myself around anti-sexist activity. I don't know whether I'm a feminist or not. I don't know whether I need to be a feminist or not in that respect, because what matters is I need to be challenging sexist activity. That's what I need to be doing, and not necessarily wasting time on whether I define myself a feminist or not. Not because I don't think feminism is important, but because I'm cis male identifying, I don't know whether feminism is legible to me. So if we're talking about anti-racism, what we're not talking about for white activists who are in support of anti-racism is having to have a full understanding of what blackness is. I think what we're saying is have a wider understanding of what whiteness is and what comes with whiteness because of that. And that's why terms and institutional structures and systems and anti-racist training can get derailed and denuded when, like today, I'm in company of peers. Then we can have a discussion about where's the limit, where's the boundary between allyship and accomplishment and speaking for. Amongst a group of activists, there is time for that. But in my opinion, that should not be the only conversation. We should be engaged in the struggle, whatever the struggle is. The struggle might be in being really conscious of the vocabulary one uses. It might be in drawing attention to the students that you teach to the source of the philosophy you're working with, and or that there are alternative readings. A colleague spoke to me recently about a concern that some of the core philosophical tenets, you know, your Hegel, Kant, Adorno, they're all white philosophers, and there may not be BIPOC equivalents. So the learning then is students, colleagues, fellows. We're using philosophical paradigms for which there are no inclusive alternatives. So let's reflect on the fact that there are no inclusive alternatives while we are using these philosophies. I don't necessarily think it's bad to talk about Kant, but I also don't think it's useful to flagellate yourself because there isn't a BIPOC equivalent or alternative to Kant. I think it's how we locate Kant when we talk about his work and how we talk about ideas of the canon. I was really struck at a conference when someone was talking about Terrell Alvin McCraney and about the fact that in some of his writing, he was drawing on the Yoruban mythos and how that was novel in terms of narrative construction and episodic nature and perspectives. Time is I'm sharing this secondhand. I'm not of Nigerian ethnicity, but time is a fluid and flexible thing. So McCraney is drawing on that as an underlying tenet, rather than going to your traditional, conventional Greek or 3-act structure. That is sort of stealth innovation for me. Suddenly, scholars are saying, I'm finding it difficult to analyze or appreciate this work because I don't understand the underlying tenets that it's based on. So I need to go and learn about it. So forgive yourself. Peer review, research, research, research. If you don't know something, go and find it out. And don't expect your colleagues who are the subject of the oppression to have to educate you. That's an additional labor that, frankly, they don't really want. They might be able to calibrate some of your stuff or adjudicate some of the stuff that you found, but they don't want to be telling you why it's really bad to pick on a person because of their skin pigmentation. They know what that's like. That's their lived experience. So they don't want to be wasting their energies doing that. They will do it, and they'll do it probably with a gritted smile, but they don't. That's not where they should be focusing their energy.
Got a couple.
Is that enough?
Oh yeah, I mean, you want to learn about anti-racism? Don't learn more about Black people. Learn more about white people. That's totally the takeaway. That's the takeaway. I'm sharing an article here in the chat. How does your positionality affect or bias your epistemology, your worldview? And take that away, read that. It really lends a great eye, a white man's eye, toward the inequalities that he was propagating and perpetuating in his own classroom and his own pedagogies. So I just dropped that in the chat for anyone who's interested in that. We have a couple questions in there. Mm-hmm. I really want to get to the issue of equity and your definitions about what true equity looks like, but I'm going to defer to folks who are here. So I think Jojo, he addressed a bit of your question. Would you like to come to the space and maybe ask it in a different way that enforces, reifies what Sylvan's been saying?
I will try to do that. Thank you, Sylvan, for talking. I could listen to you talk all day. Thank you so much for your time. My question was about.
I'm blushing.
My question was about you mentioned a little bit, the systems of power that are in place and, how they're sort of invisible. Something that I'm brushing up against in my own life is power structures of the institution of a 501c3 nonprofit, and how it's tied to money and funding, and the people who hold power have money, and it's a thing that I keep brushing up against. Is I could tell the institution to fuck off and go make my own work over here, and I do that sometimes, but I have a lot less money to do that.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear your perspective a little bit, maybe some kind of anecdote of, because right now I am like I'm trying to write a letter to a board and tell them that they, and
yeah.
yeah.
I feel your pain, and it is pain. A learned colleague of mine at Central, who's deputy director of research, drew a thing to my attention which really changed my orientation around this. It was an essay from Foucault about civility, and that civility is to paraphrase Foucault in a couple of seconds, that civility was a very muting and diminishing set of behaviors, and that one of the ways to resist the privations that are being put on the oppressed is to not be civil in the face of incivility. Okay? Now that's different from just being plain rude. I don't mean that. I mean, it's adopting a certain kind of assertiveness. And that's the assertiveness that sits behind me saying, I don't want to say decolonization. I want to say anti-racism. I want to say anti-homophobia. I want to say anti-sexism. I don't want to dress it up. And employing, do you remember the American TV show about the police detective Columbo? And Columbo used to always go like, I've just got one more question. And Columbo would locate himself in a position where everyone that he was investigating thought they were superior to him, but he always caught them. So there's a certain interest and certain maybe even perverse beauty in being in those institutional structures and asking the honest question. So, chair of committee, we've got a mission that's anti-racist, and we've got an anti-racist strategy. Where are we with it? And sitting with the discomfiture. Because it's not that you're being disrespectful, it's that you are wanting to know what's actually happened. And if the filibustering, well, there's a search committee and we've got a task and finish group, okay, great. But where are we with that? And it can get incredibly tiresome, and there is a labor to it. But particularly if there are people who've sworn a certain kind of allegiance to these things, but are not fulfilling them, it's difficult to get away from that. There's a risk. I'm an early career researcher in my institution, and some of me was genuinely scared, perturbed about the idea of, if I stand up and start making a noise, am I going to lose my job? We don't have a tenure structure in the UK, but there's an awful lot of precarity around academia. And the cynical part of me was able to go, in the middle of a racism crisis, if the institution were to dismiss an academic of color who is standing up and talking about racism, that could be a PR nuke. But is that enough? So I think there are a number of approaches that you can maybe apply tactically to get around that. If it's about resources, and the resources are sitting in one section of the community, shall I say, remember that the other sections of the community, some of whom you might be working with, also have access to resources. And they're resources that are often not called on. I forget their name, but one of the major black theatre companies that's based in New York bought the land that the theatre is on and the land around it, and is using their power as landlords now in real estate to feed their endowment kitty. So they're in the business. The theatre company is actually in the real estate business, but their mission is theatre and social justice. So it might be about how you seek different alliances, how you think about the power that you have and the agency that you have, because it might be that you can't get to the CEO in 3 jumps. It might be that you can start to explode certain myths that have been used to sort of keep the status quo in a position of stasis, and then start to re-articulate the argument. You know, if we look at Hollywood, which is not the most diverse place, is it? The truism that the majority cinema-going audience did not want to see stories where they may not be the main protagonist had been the reason for negating an awful lot of high-quality commissioning, until things like The Black Panther, How to Get Away with Murder, Empire started hitting the screens, and suddenly Stiesel and Unorthodox, suddenly we're seeing narratives and dramas that are set in and around so-called minority groupings. Didn't stop the audiences watching them being strongly critically received, and suddenly this idea like, yeah, they don't really want to see black stories. Who are they, and what are black stories? There are stories. And it's interesting that mythology is diminishing. I don't think it'll disappear. Crikey, I just did that thing, that thumb pointy thing. I'm not going to do that again. I don't think they'll disappear, but the argument has lost a lot of its momentum now. I think looking at the approaches differently in the organizations that you're working, so that it may not be the season. It may be about inviting members of the community who are not often users of the space to come and be ushers, to come on to script reading groups, to insinuate themselves into the institution, so that the they changes. And when the they changes, the programmers, the dramaturgs change too. We're seeing it massively in London, because Kwame Kweyama is now the artistic director of the Young Vic. It's not that he's putting on black plays, but he's bringing a different, obviously it helps that he is the artistic director, but he's bringing a different response and just wanting different people to hang out in the theatre foyer, to see themselves represented on stage, great, but also to see different interpretations of so-called canonical classics, because it's not that they are not for them, but it might be that they haven't been invited to engage in them. When I talk to lots of young people that I work with and say, do you like theatre? They go, I don't like theatre. Have you ever been to the theatre? No, but I don't like it. And it's getting into challenging, upsetting, destabilizing that state of being. One of, it's quite a long memory now, best moments I had before I came to Central was being invited by an English teacher of a secondary school that had an association with the institution I was working and researching in, to go on a school trip with them, to go and see Othello. Sitting on the coach, I don't particularly like Othello, but it was a really great cast. And sitting on the coach with these young people who were like, this is gonna be boring, right? And we got into the theatre, and it was a very, very good production. And suddenly, these young people were like, this is epic. That man there, he's a bastard. We don't want to do that's right. And they were in. And they'd been told to hate Shakespeare in the way that we're told that school meals taste bad. And suddenly, it wasn't dumbed down. It was just, God, I did it again. It was just good. And yeah, some of the language they didn't get. And so they say, what do they mean there? When you told them, they got it. It didn't need to be in slang. It just needed to be explained, and they got it. So I think for me, it's the approach. Uh, the the Barbershop Chronicles, when it first started touring the UK, actually when it was first at the National Theatre, inside the corridors of power at the National, there was real concern that because there was so many ethnic accents on stage, that the audience would not be able to understand it. Now, the reality is they may not be able to understand the minutiae of the cultural references that sit within the storytelling around Ellam's play, right? But they understand the plot and they don't lose anything. And yes, they may gain something if they happen to be sitting beside a Nigerian patron who laughs at an in-joke that they can't see. But how many in-jokes are there in The Simpsons that you don't see? Yeah? Because your cultural reference set is different. I'm not going to liken the Barbershop Chronicles to The Simpsons, but I'm talking about how you build a performance that individuals can engage in. So try not to bang your head on a locked door. Do the work, and sometimes do the work somewhere else that pays so that you can do the work you want to do with the surplus. That's not really an answer, but in the undergraduate course, at the end for the final year students, there's a series of lectures and they say things like, when you were a freelancer, what was your rate? And I would say it depended who was asking. And you practice that poker face, and the big institution that has a large budget, I'm $1,500 a day. Yeah, I don't often get paid $1,500 a day anymore. The small community theatre group that really needs you, I pay them for the privilege of working with them because I've got $1,500 a day from somewhere else. Okay, not a perfect answer. It's not a perfect world. So we have to take our wins where we can and move the site of engagement. So if there's something that you think is not happening in your space or spaces, what intervention can you build to make it happen? Often there is a British director, youth theatre director, who's called Ned Glazier, who runs a company called Company 3. And he talks about, gosh, now I've said his name, I've forgotten what he calls it, edgelands. And edgelands are the territories where conversations happen during the breaks in workshops or before or on the way to see a performance or something. And he's saying, and I agree with him, that edgelands are the place where gold lies. Those conversations that happen when the participants are waiting to do the workshop or having a break from the workshop are where the gold lies. So one of the things that I've always said to the facilitators who I'm working with in terms of development is, when you have a break on a project, you don't really have a break. You need to be in the room because that's the edgeland. That's where you get to hear stuff. People bond over fried chicken. People bond over fizzy colas and tea, and they discover commonalities and differences. Again, one of my greatest memories working on an intergenerational project was when a 68-year-old woman brought in her new iPhone to show to a 14-year-old girl she'd been working with for 3 weeks. And to see the shock on the 14-year-old girl's face that this woman had an iPhone, and not just that, knew how to work it and had done all the research, and suddenly they'd bonded over tech. Nothing to do with theatre. But because they were in the same space at the same time, those happy accidents can happen in the edgelands. Slightly off road now, but that's in some way trying to approach that question.
You did great. You did that. That was an amazing answer. And so I can give you an answer as a producer. And for me, like dealing with boards, and you're looking money in the face and whatever. First off, solid priorities about and solid values within the organization should help create binary choices so that when you're looking at a board member, it's not about conservative versus liberal. It's about, hey, we need to provide anti-racism training for our front of house staff because there were some comments made. Do you agree or disagree? Well, if you agree with that statement, you just took the liberal stance, right? You took the anti-racist stance here. So the more that we're able to simplify those decisions for really they're non-stakeholders, they're board members, they give X amount of money a year or some time, some talent, whatever. But at the end of the day, as an executive director of an organization, I'm the one that needs to be living and acting those values into the wider world. And so if someone's in conflict with that, I'm not going to shift my values away from making sure that our space is accessible to everyone, as opposed to I'm gonna compromise those values in order to keep a chief donor on the board because it's not worth it. It's just not worth it anymore. We've been playing that game too long. It's like 3:59, and I'm gonna skip up with apologies to Karen and to Kate and everybody. I want to skip down to one last question, if this is okay, because I think Celeste brought it right back to what it is we're gathered around this conference for. Celeste, you wanna come into space and ask your question?
Sure.
And I guess we're gonna run a little bit long. I hope that's okay, but this is such an amazing conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sylvan. It's been amazing listening to you, and in the original videotape lecture, you mentioned how Shakespeare has been used in oppressive ways historically, how in modern practice do people avoid this? How do you recognize when it is happening, especially when I think now when it happens, it's probably less intentional, generally at least, than it was in the past. And then how do you recognize when to either like how to change course and how you go about that, or when maybe it's like this time, maybe we shouldn't be using Shakespeare?
I just have to make that laugh like audible.
Yeah.
That's such a big question, isn't it?
Huge. Okay, so I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, but a lot of this, I know I'm at this conference and I'm not. A lot of this is about context. The way historically in which Shakespeare was used as a colonizing force was because it was the epitome of culture, and it was about taking culture to the masses / savages / uncultured. So there is one area of research in that respect, which allows students, colleagues, peers to engage with that so they can help to draw some of their own conclusions. But interestingly, there is an additional vein of interesting knowledge if one looks at the social history that sits around when those particular plays were written. So you take like Macbeth. There are major socio-political dynamics in Macbeth that are nothing to do with the plot. They're to do with how a writer gets themselves recommissioned because they are writing something which puts their patron in a good light. Yeah? Because I think it's Banquo's family that were actually related to the king, yeah? Or the queen. And it's that awareness that is also additionally useful for students so that they can understand that, hey, there's a reason why it's written this way. It's not about a fidelity to history. It's, I don't know if there's any playwrights in the room. It's about making sure that my play hits the stage and continues to get commissioned and that I can eat. And that was up for grabs for Shakespeare, just like it was for any writer now. And then I think a transparent contextualization of that socioeconomic habitus allows students to engage with some of the richness, depth, nuance that sits around Shakespeare, but also some of the things that are contestable and challenging. So if I'm teaching, that's why I don't, but if I'm teaching Othello, then I'm going to teach Othello and Titus Andronicus at the same time. And I'm going to say to the students, have you noticed there are two Moors in this canon here? One's a psychopath and one has seizures when things get really stressful. Can we find any other protagonists in Shakespeare that do this? No. Interesting. So that it's there. It's a question. What's going on here? So if that's the case, if these two, actually there are a number of psychopathic characters in Shakespeare, but if these traits are being endowed on these characters in this way, why is that? What does that make you think? What message does that send? Because it's the semiotics of this that are also important. So I can freely confess, I really like Shakespeare. I like language. I like the way it works. I like the complexity of the narrative. Do I think he is the greatest writer ever to walk the earth? Doubtful, but really good. And I think it's putting it into that context. And if you're working with a very culturally rich participatory environment, inviting them to bring, not as a labor, but to bring examples from cultural traditions that are more familiar to them into the room. Are there stories like Macbeth in the pantheons that you study? You know, if you think about, I know the writer of the text is hugely questionable, but the idea of the hero of a thousand faces-eyed concept, then it's not about saying these narratives only exist in this minority form, because European theatre is actually a minority genre. Yeah, it should be taught in minority theatre, not as basic theatre. So this idea that understanding the social context around this, we're probably massively overrunning, aren't we? Around this construct, this artifact is important. So when I met Scott and he was talking about this wonderful conference, I was saying about my desire at Central to want to teach acting students about colonization when they're learning RP, because RP is the lingua franca of colony. So it's not necessarily that RP is bad in and of itself. It's the fact that the people that conquered the world spoke that way. And we need to understand that when we speak that way today, because that's the colonial residue. It's not just about phonetics, whatever voice coaches might say. It's not. And I'm not saying that it changes the fact that standard English, received pronunciation, can erase other cultural traits. They are still givens in an industry, and the industry of acting has not been as freed up as some other areas by things like immediate technology. You still, in the main, have to get a training to be able to work in the industry. It's rare that you can come in as a gifted natural. It's not like sport. So an awareness of how to tactically navigate through some of those strictures and structures is probably the most ethical way to train actors or activists. Applied theatre is a tactical discipline. And I say tactical on purpose, because if you're being tactical, according to de Certeau, you are not in a position to strategically delineate the environment. Strategic thinking is high level, high power thinking. Tactical thinking is punk, undercover, guerrilla activity. Yeah? So guerrilla warfare, I think, was, yes, Karen, you Karen, de Certeau, yes. Guerrilla warfare was built and explored by the Duke of Wellington when he was facing massively outgunned, out-soldiered by Napoleon. Cut and run, don't play by the rules, know how to navigate on a battlefield. I know this is like all military metaphor, but know how to navigate on a battlefield that you didn't decide. Because that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing in I've gone further and I've been calling it creative insurgence, and it raises eyebrows, but that's what it is. We go in and we do things differently. I don't know whether that answers the question.
That's great. That was great. Thank you so much, Sylvan. Wow. We would probably love to sit here for another 2 hours at least, I think. But someday we're going to be sitting up and I'm going to be like, okay, so what does true equity look like? And then we'll have that 7-hour-long conversation. Thank you again, Sylvan Baker. You are an inspiration, and I'm really looking forward to being able to give you a hug for this wonderful talk that you've given us today, and hope to see you very soon. And please do your open invitation. Join us for all these sessions that are coming up, and if you can't, because it's 5 hours later, they're all recorded too, so you can find them there.
I just want to say one thing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you and take your questions. And it's lovely to see you. Terminology: Scott, white and non-white.
Mm-hmm.
What that does to those people who are not white is something to reflect on.
Yeah.
We're having a huge battle in the UK about black and minority ethnic. People have forgotten that it's an acronym, and they're saying BAME. There's no such thing as BAME.
Mm-hmm.
There's no BAME in the game. So it's really interesting, because I think that's how deep this challenge is.
Yeah.
It's in the language. It's in the DNA of communities. So we have to be laser sharp on it. So what is the collective noun? I don't know, but it isn't not white.
It's global majority, isn't it?
Well, global majority is one, but not white is a double erasure.
Yeah.
Because you are not the right thing and you're not anything. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I know,
yeah.
and it's really easy. I do it all the time. I say white, not white. But it's just a thought about it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I really
Yeah?
appreciate that for sure. Yeah. What is that? How do we, yeah, that's something to leave the session and think about.
Something to ponder with on a Friday afternoon stroke evening. Thank you so much, folks. It was a privilege to speak with you.
Oh, you too, Sylvan. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.